72 years old, a bitterly cold winter night, and the man who had signed every property deed to secure his son's future was sitting shivering on a park bench, penniless, homeless. His own son had slammed the door in his face. His own daughter-in-law had called him a burden. But what Derek Whitmore never knew, that the father he thought he had completely broken held the key to everything he had. Like, comment the city you're watching, and subscribe to the channel to follow this story to the end. I still remember the exact temperature that night, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. I know because I checked my phone 3 times while I sat on that park bench, watching my own breath disappear into the dark air, trying to convince myself that what had just happened to me was real. It was real. My name is Harold Whitmore. I am 72 years old. I spent 43 years building a business, raising a son, and sacrificing things I can no longer name because the list is too long and too heavy. I gave up vacations. I gave up hobbies. I gave up the years when my knees still worked and my back didn't ache every time I stood up from a chair. I gave all of it, every single hour, to the Whitmore name, to the legacy, to the future I believed I was building for my family. And on the coldest night of that January, my son Derek and his wife Sandra looked me in the eye and told me to get out of their house. Not their house. My house. The house I paid for. The house where I had lived for 11 years before Derek moved his family in, and slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice, made me feel like a guest in my own home. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what happens when you're old and angry and sitting on a frozen park bench at 11 o'clock at night with nowhere to go. Your mind jumps around. It tries to make sense of things that don't make sense. Let me go back to the beginning, or at least the beginning of the end. It started the way most disasters start, quietly, with small things that seemed reasonable at the time. Derek had always been smart. I'll give him that. My son was sharp in the way that certain people are sharp. Not with their hands, not with their hearts, but with their eyes. He watched things. He calculated. He waited. When he was a boy, Derek used to stand at the edge of games instead of jumping in. He'd observe for 10 minutes, figure out who was winning and why, and then position himself exactly where the advantage was. Other kids thought he was shy. I thought he was strategic. I was proud of that, God help me. I used to brag about it to my brother Frank. That boy of mine, he's got a mind like a calculator, I'd say. Frank would just nod and smile and never say what I think he was thinking. I wish I'd listened to whatever it was Frank never said. Derek married Sandra Colton when he was 31. She was beautiful. The kind of beautiful that makes you ignore things you shouldn't ignore. She had this way of smiling at you that made you feel like you were the most important person in the room, and then the moment you turned away, you'd catch her expression changing in the reflection of a window and realize the smile was a tool, not a feeling. I didn't trust her from the beginning. That's the honest truth. There was something about the way she handled people, efficiently, like they were resources to be allocated, that made my stomach tighten. But Derek loved her, or at least he wanted her, and I had learned by then that those two things feel identical until they don't. My wife Eleanor had passed 2 years before the wedding. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to gone. The kind of thing that doesn't give you time to prepare. Doesn't give you time to say everything you meant to say over the course of 38 years together. I was still raw when Derek brought Sandra home. I think that rawness made me easier to manage. Sandra knew how to handle grief. She was gentle with it in the beginning. She'd bring me meals when she visited. She'd ask about Eleanor's garden, which I'd been trying and failing to maintain, and she'd say things like, "Harold, you're still so strong. I don't know how you do it." She was building something. I didn't know it then. I know it now. The conversation about moving in happened on a Sunday afternoon, 3 years after the wedding. Derek and Sandra came for lunch, which was unusual because they almost never drove out to the property unless there was a reason, and I should have identified that reason before I put food on the table. Derek waited until after dessert. He had inherited that from me, the habit of building up to difficult conversations by making everything comfortable first. "Dad," he said, "Sandra and I have been talking." "Okay," I said. I kept my hands around my coffee cup. This house is too big for one person. He gestured around the dining room, the high ceilings, the windows Eleanor had loved because of the light in the afternoons. You're rattling around in here alone, and frankly, we're worried about you. Sandra nodded with perfect timing. We worry so much, Harold, especially in winter. If something happened, nothing's going to happen, I said. You don't know that, Derek said, and his voice was gentle but firm, the kind of firm that doesn't leave room for arguing. Dad, we want to move in. Turn the east wing into our space, give you the main rooms. We'd be right here. You wouldn't be alone anymore. I looked at him across the table. My son. His mother's nose, my father's chin, some combination of the two of us and 30 years of choices that had made him into someone I loved, but sometimes didn't fully recognize. I'm not alone, I said. I have people. You have Frank 3 towns over and a housekeeper who comes twice a week, Derek said. Not unkindly, just accurately. That was always the way with Derek. He did his research before the meeting. I should have said no. I know that now with the certainty of a man who has had too many cold nights to think it over. I should have looked at my son across that table and said, Derek, I appreciate the concern, but this is my home and I am fine. I should have trusted the tightness in my stomach. Instead, I said, let me think about it. And 3 weeks later, I said yes. Patat. The first year wasn't bad. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who want to understand how something like this happens to a grown man, an educated man, a man who built his own business from nothing. How does a person let themselves be slowly removed from their own life? It happens the way any erosion happens. Not all at once. Grain by grain. Sandra redecorated the living room to make it feel more cohesive, and Eleanor's reading chair ended up in storage. I didn't say anything because it was just a chair. Derek started handling the household accounts because I was already managing so much, and my name came off the utilities and the maintenance contracts. I didn't push back because I was tired and it seemed practical. My schedule started being mentioned in planning conversations as a variable rather than a priority. Sunday dinners at 6 became Saturday lunches at noon because it was easier for the kids. I didn't object because I didn't want to be difficult. The kids. Derek and Sandra had 2 children, Marcus and Lily, and I loved those grandchildren in the helpless, unguarded way you love small people who have no idea how complicated the world is yet. Marcus had Eleanor's eyes. Lily had a laugh that could pull me out of the worst days. I told myself that their presence made the compromises worth it, that having family nearby, having noise in the house again, having little shoes by the back door, that was what Eleanor would have wanted. I told myself a lot of things in those years. By the 3rd year, I had become a guest. It wasn't a single decision. It was 100 small decisions, each one reasonable on its own, that added up to a situation that felt impossible to name while you were living inside it. I ate my meals at times that fit Sandra's meal planning. I watched television in my bedroom because the living room was the family space in the evenings. When Derek's business associates came for dinner, I was sometimes invited and sometimes not, depending on what Sandra had decided about the evening's tone. I had a standing invitation to my own dining room that required her approval. My son had a study on the ground floor, and the door was usually closed. When I knocked, he would open it with the look of a man being interrupted, even when I had nothing urgent to say and was simply looking for a few minutes of conversation. We used to talk for hours, Derek and I. About business, about history, about the kinds of things men talk about when they respect each other's minds. By year 3, I was getting 10 minutes if the timing was right, and Derek was in the mood. I started eating breakfast early to avoid the morning rush. I started going to bed early to avoid the evenings. I started making myself small in the spaces I occupied, pulling my elbows in, keeping my opinions to myself, trying not to take up more room than was comfortable for everyone else. I became a man who apologized for existing, and I didn't even realize it was happening until the night it stopped. It was the 15th of January. I remember every detail of that night with the clarity that only shock can produce. The argument started over dinner, or rather, it started over a dinner I wasn't supposed to be at. Derek had a client in town, a man named Gareth Bryce, someone important in the real estate sector whose money Derek had been pursuing for 2 years. Sandra had planned an intimate dinner for the 4 of them, Derek, Sandra, Gareth, and Gareth's wife. And I had assumed, reasonably I thought, that I would join them. It was my dining room. I had helped arrange the flowers that afternoon because Sandra had asked me to. At 5:30, Sandra came to find me in my bedroom and told me they'd decided to keep the evening more exclusive. "I'd prefer you stayed up here tonight, Harold," she said. She didn't apologize. She said it the way you tell a child to stay out of the kitchen while adults are talking. Something shifted in me. Something small but real, like the first crack in ice. "That's my dining room," I said. "Harold, that is my dining room, Sandra. Those are my chairs. That table was made by Eleanor's father in 1974. Her expression changed. Not much. Sandra was too controlled for dramatic changes. But enough. A micro-tightening around the eyes. A careful recalibration. "I understand this feels difficult," she said. "But Derek has worked incredibly hard for this relationship with Gareth. One awkward evening could compromise months of effort. Surely you can understand that." "Awkward," I repeated. "I don't mean you think I would be awkward." She didn't say anything, which was, I realized, its own kind of answer. I ate dinner alone in my room that night. Cold cuts and bread that I put together myself in the kitchen while they laughed downstairs. I could hear them through the floor. Sandra's hostess laugh. Derek's confident business voice. The clinking of Eleanor's good crystal. I sat on the edge of my bed and I ate, and I listened, and I tried to remember the last time my son had asked me how I was feeling and actually waited for the answer. I couldn't think of one. 2 weeks later, the conversation happened that I have replayed in my mind 1,000 times since. I had been reading in the sitting room off the main hallway, a small room that everyone had tacitly agreed was mine, one of the few spaces in the house I could occupy without negotiation, when Derek came in without knocking. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and he had the look on his face that meant he'd rehearsed what he was about to say. "Dad, we need to talk." I set my book down. "All right." He came in and sat across from me, and for a moment he just looked at his hands. My son, who never fidgeted. "Sandra and I have been discussing the living situation," he said, "and we think—" He paused, restarted. "We've outgrown this arrangement." I didn't say anything. I waited. "The kids are getting older. They need more space. Marcus wants his own study room. Lily's music lessons take up half the afternoon, and Sandra needs a proper space for her work now that she's expanded the consulting." He was talking fast, listing things, building a wall of logistics. "We need the East Wing back. And honestly, Dad, we've been thinking it might be better for everyone if you had your own space. Somewhere that was entirely yours. A smaller place. Maybe a senior community." "A senior community," I said. "There are some excellent ones. Sandra has researched. You want me to move out." Derek stopped talking. He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not guilt exactly, but discomfort. The discomfort of a man who has made a decision he knows is wrong but has committed to anyway. "We want what's best for everyone," he said. That phrase. I will remember that phrase until the last day I have. We want what's best for everyone. As if I were not a part of everyone. As if the everyone in that sentence was a bounded category that happened not to include me. "This is my house, Derek," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that. "My name is on the deed." "Dad, I paid the property taxes on this house for 31 years. Your mother and I brought you home from the hospital to this house. She died in the bedroom at the end of the hall. My name is on the deed." "We know," Derek said, and something in his voice shifted, hardened. "But ownership is complicated when you've been—" He stopped himself. I leaned forward. "When I've been what, Derek?" He met my eyes. "When you've made certain financial arrangements that affect your standing." The room was very quiet. "What arrangements?" I said. It wasn't a question. It was a door opening onto something I had been keeping very carefully closed. Derek looked away. "We should talk about this another time." "No," I said. "We should talk about it now." But he stood up and he said, "I'll have Sandra pull together some information about communities in the area. There are really some beautiful options. You'd have your own space, your independence, people your own age." And then he walked out of the room. And I sat there with my book in my lap and felt something I had not felt since the night Eleanor died. the feeling of freefall. The weeks that followed were a kind of deterioration I don't have clean words for. Sandra began leaving printed brochures on my breakfast table. Sunrise Gardens, Oakwood Senior Living, Maple Crest Retirement Community. Each one with photographs of smiling elderly people doing watercolors and playing shuffleboard in carpeted rooms that smelled, I imagined, of industrial cleaning, solution, and resignation. I did not look at them. I stacked them on the corner of the kitchen counter, and when the pile grew, I moved it to the recycling bin. Derek and I had 3 more conversations about the situation, each one more strained than the last. He talked about logistics and timelines and what was fair. He did not once ask me what I wanted. He did not once say, "I'm sorry, Dad," or "I know this is hard," or acknowledge in any direct way that he was asking me to leave the home where I had lived for 31 years. Sandra was more direct. That, at least, I can say about her. Sandra didn't pretend. One afternoon, she found me in the garden where I had been trying to work on Eleanor's rose beds, something I was bad at but kept attempting because it made me feel close to something I had lost. And she sat down on the stone bench beside me and said, in that precise voice of hers, "Harold, I want to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty." I set down my trowel. I looked at her. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. "Derek loves you, but you're becoming a burden on this household. Not financially. We're not saying that. Emotionally. The tension you create simply by resisting a reasonable request is affecting the children. It's affecting my marriage." The word burden. She said it with such efficiency, as if it were a clinical term. A logistical assessment. I was 72 years old, and a woman my son had chosen was calling me a burden in my own garden. "Get out of my garden," I said. My voice was quiet. I surprised myself. Sandra stood. Her expression was carefully neutral. "We've been more than patient, Harold." "Get out of my garden," I said again. She left, and I sat in the mud beside Eleanor's rose beds, and I pressed my hands into the cold February dirt, and I shook. Not from the cold, from something else, something that had been building in me for months that I didn't yet have a name for. Rage, maybe. Or grief. Sometimes they feel the same. Again, the final night was a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because Marcus had a school concert on Friday that I had been looking forward to, and I had bought a small gift for him, a notebook with a dark blue cover because he liked writing stories, and I had thought maybe afterward we could get ice cream, and I could ask him about the characters he was creating. I never got to give him that notebook. It was late, almost 10 o'clock, and I was coming down the stairs to get a glass of water, and I could hear Derek and Sandra talking in the kitchen. Not arguing. They rarely argued, those two. Their disagreements were more like negotiations, but their voices were urgent in a way that made me stop on the stairs without meaning to. "Can't keep doing this indefinitely," Sandra was saying. "He's not going anywhere on his own. You know that." "I know," Derek said. "Then we need to be clear. One conversation. Give him a date." "Sandra, Derek." Her voice was flat, final. "He is not going to cooperate unless we make it impossible not to. You know how he is. He'll keep quietly refusing, and we'll keep having the same argument in 6 different forms for the next 2 years. Give him a date. This month." Silence. "And if he won't?" Derek said. Another silence. Longer. "Then we make it clear that he's not welcome," Sandra said. "Kindly, but clearly." I stood on that staircase and I felt my heart do something strange, a kind of slow flinching, like something inside me was protecting itself. I was listening to my son agree, in his silence, to something that I would have told you 6 years ago he was incapable of. I went back upstairs. I didn't get my glass of water. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, and I stared at the wall that used to have a photograph of Eleanor and me on our 20th anniversary, and I tried to understand what I had become in this house, what they had made me, or what I had allowed myself to become. I'm still not certain which. They came to my room the following evening, both of them. That should have told me everything, that Sandra was there, standing just behind Derek's shoulder, because with Sandra present, there would be no wavering, no moment of hesitation where Derek's actual feelings might surface. Derek sat in the chair by my window. Sandra stood near the door. "Dad," Derek began. We've made a decision. I was sitting on my bed. I had decided earlier that day that I would not make it easier for him by being conciliatory. I would not nod and murmur and tell him I understood. I would make him say the thing out loud, and I would make him look at me while he said it. Okay, I said, we need you to be out of the house by the end of the month. 12 days. I had 12 days. I looked at Derek, really looked at him. The jaw I had watched grow from a boy's soft chin into a man's hard angles, the eyes that held Eleanor's darkness and my father's shrewdness. I looked for something in them that I could recognize as what he used to be. You're asking me to leave my own home, I said. Dad, no. I stood up, and I was surprised by how steady I felt. Say what it is, Derek. Don't soften it. You're asking me to leave the home I paid for, the home I've lived in for 31 years, the home where your mother died, because I have become inconvenient. Derek's jaw tightened. That's not what this is. Then what is it? It's about what's right for this family, Sandra said. She took a step forward. Harold, you're not contributing to this household. You're not— I own this household, I said. My voice was louder now, and I hadn't planned that, but I didn't try to control it. I built everything that made it possible for this family to live the way you live. Derek's first car, his college, his down payment on his first apartment, his business startup. Do you remember that, Derek? Do you remember who wrote the check when the bank said no? Derek looked down. Do you remember? I said. Yes, he said, quietly. I remember too, I said. I remember all of it. And I remember thinking, every single time, that it was an investment, not in a business, in a person, in my son. The room was very still. I was wrong, I said. I don't know what I expected. I think some small, stubborn part of me expected that Derek would look up and the words would reach something in him that was still intact, that there was still a version of my son somewhere behind the financial calculations and the Sandra-managed efficiency of his life, a version who remembered who I was and what I had done and what family was supposed to mean. What happened instead was this. Sandra said, Harold, we understand you're upset, and Derek said nothing at all, and that silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. Where are you going? Sandra said. Out, I said. It's almost 11 o'clock, Derek said. There was something in his voice now. Not concern exactly, but a reflex of concern, the shape of it without the substance. Dad, it's freezing outside. Yes, I said. It is. I walked out of my room. I walked down the stairs past the photographs on the wall that included a picture of Derek at 8 years old sitting on my shoulders at a state fair, his ice cream cone tipping sideways, and both of us laughing. I walked through the front hall, past Eleanor's coat rack that Sandra had moved to make room for a console table with a vase that was always empty. I opened the front door. The cold hit me like something physical. January in the Northeast, 10:40 at night. The kind of cold that has weight. I heard Derek's voice from the top of the stairs. Dad, come back inside. We can talk more in the morning. I kept walking. I made it 6 blocks before my knees started to remind me that I was 72 years old, and it was 14 degrees, and I had walked out of the house without gloves. There was a park, Millfield Park, where I used to take Derek when he was small, and the pond froze in winter, and he would try to skate on it in his regular shoes. I sat down on one of the benches near the old oak tree. The wood was frozen, and the cold went through my jacket immediately. I sat there, and I looked at the dark sky, and I thought about everything I had done, and everything I had failed to do, and everything that had been done to me, and I tried to locate, somewhere inside myself, the thing that was going to keep me from simply deciding to stop. Not from dying. I wasn't thinking about dying. I was thinking about collapsing, about lying down in the cold and the dark and letting the next hour belong entirely to gravity and exhaustion and the simple animal desire to stop hurting. My phone was in my jacket pocket. I looked at it. 3 contacts presented themselves immediately, without me having to think. My brother Frank, my oldest friend Tom Garrett, and a number I almost never called, Margaret Ellison, who had been my father's estate attorney for 20 years and had taken over the firm when her partner retired. I didn't call Frank because it was almost midnight, and he had a heart condition, and I didn't want to frighten him. I didn't call Tom because I would have had to explain too much, and I was too cold and too tired for the volume of explaining required. I called Margaret. She answered on the third ring, which told me she was still awake, which told me something about Margaret, that she was a person who worked late even at 68, which I already knew but was somehow glad to be reminded of. "Harold," her voice was alert, not groggy. "What's wrong?" "Margaret," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "I need to ask you something." "Of course. Where are you? You sound—" "I'm outside. It doesn't matter. Margaret, I need you to tell me something about my father's trust." A pause. Brief. "All right." "Is it still intact?" I said. "All of it." "Is it the way he left it?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Harold," Margaret said, and her voice had changed. Careful now, measured, the way lawyers get when something important is being approached. "Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" "Tell me now," I said. "Please." The park was quiet around me. Somewhere far away a car passed on the main road, its headlights sweeping across the bare trees, and then it was dark again and quiet again, and I was alone on a bench in the cold waiting for a woman I trusted to tell me something I needed to know. "Yes," Margaret said finally. "It's intact, every cent, and Harold—" She stopped. "What?" I said. "You are still the sole trustee," she said carefully. "Nothing has changed. You have full authority." I sat with that for a moment, with what it meant, with all the things Derek did not know, that Sandra did not know, that no one who had spent the last 3 years systematically reducing me to a burden in my own home had any idea about. "Okay," I said. My breath was visible in the cold air, small white clouds disappearing. "Harold, are you all right? Where are you?" "I'll be at your office at 9, I said. I hung up the phone. I sat on that frozen bench for another few minutes, feeling the cold and the dark and the peculiar sensation of something reorganizing itself inside me, something that had been bent in a particular direction for a long time, slowly, carefully straightening. My son thought he had won. My son thought he had taken everything that mattered. He had forgotten, or perhaps he had never known, that his grandfather was a man who trusted no one with everything, that my father had built protections into the architecture of our family's wealth that were so quiet, so carefully constructed that they had sat undisturbed for 32 years, waiting for a moment exactly like this one. Derek had forgotten that I was my father's son. I stood up from the bench. My knees ached, and my hands were nearly numb, and I had nowhere to sleep that night, and 12 days left on a deadline set by my own son. But something had shifted. Some counterweight had moved. I put my phone in my pocket, and I started walking. Not back toward the house. Forward toward the main road, toward a 24-hour diner I knew was 4 blocks east where the coffee was bad, and the booths were warm and no one would ask me any questions. I was going to sit there until morning, and then I was going to go see Margaret, and then everything that came next was going to be different from everything that came before. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. I didn't have a plan fully formed. I was 72 years old and cold and angry and exhausted, not a general marshaling his forces. But I had something I hadn't had in years, something my son had accidentally given back to me when he opened his mouth and said those words in my bedroom. I had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing in the world. The coffee at Raina's diner was exactly as bad as I remembered. Thin and burnt and served in a ceramic mug with a chip on the rim that caught your lip if you weren't careful. I sat in the back booth with my jacket still on because I couldn't stop shivering, and I wrapped both hands around that mug, and I drank 3 cups before the shaking stopped. The waitress was a young woman, maybe 25, with dark circles under her eyes, and the particular efficiency of someone working a double shift who has stopped expecting anything interesting to happen. She refilled my cup without being asked, twice, and the third time she set the pot down and looked at me with the direct, uncomplicated concern of someone who has seen enough late-night booth sitters to recognize one. "You eating anything?" she said. Toast, I said. Please. She nodded and left without comment, and I sat there and thought about my father. Chester Whitmore had been a quiet man in the way that mountains are quiet. Not because there was nothing happening, but because what was happening was too large and too deep to make much surface noise. He built the original Whitmore construction supply business over 40 years, starting with a single lumber yard and a truck he drove himself. And by the time he handed it to me, he had 4 locations, 112 employees, and a reputation that meant something in 3 counties. He also had a philosophy about money that he stated exactly once, when I was about 23 years old and had just made my first significant investment decision without asking him first. "Harold," he said, sitting across from me in the office where he had worked for 30 years, not angry, just steady. "Money has a memory. It remembers where it came from, and it remembers who handled it right. You want to protect what you build? You don't put all of it in reach of anyone who might reach for it, not even family, especially family." I had thought he was being cynical. I had smiled and nodded and assumed it was old man caution from a generation that didn't trust banks, that hid cash in mattresses, that couldn't fully believe in the stability of anything. Sitting in that diner at midnight with frozen hands and no place to sleep, I understood for the first time that my father hadn't been cynical at all. He'd been prescient. The Whitmore Family Trust had been established 32 years ago by my father, 2 years before his death. He had done it quietly, with Margaret's predecessor, a careful man named Owen Ellison, who understood that the best legal protection was the kind nobody talked about at dinner. The structure was not complicated, but it was deliberate. The trust held the primary family assets, certain investment portfolios, a commercial property in the east part of the city, and a substantial cash reserve that my father had accumulated and protected over 40 years. The assets inside the trust were managed separately from the operational business, which I had eventually sold 11 years ago at a number that allowed me to stop working without thinking about money. What my father had built into the trust, and what I had never fully explained to Derek, a failure I was only now understanding the full weight of, was a trustee structure that placed complete administrative control with a single named individual. Not a committee, not a co-trustee arrangement, one person, me. Every distribution required my authorization. Every change to beneficiary designations required my signature. Every investment decision, every withdrawal, every modification to the trust terms, all of it flowed through me and only me, with Margaret's firm as the oversight body to ensure the legal integrity of each transaction. Derek knew the trust existed. What he didn't know, what I had, in my own failure of honesty, never made fully clear, was what that structure actually meant. He knew there was a trust. He believed, from conversations we'd had years earlier when I was still comfortable and our relationship was still intact, that he was the primary beneficiary and that the assets were essentially his by right, already allocated, just waiting for the formality of inheritance. He had never read the documents. Why would he? His father was still alive and managing it, and Derek trusted that his position was secure the same way he trusted that the sun would come up, as a fact of the universe that required no verification. It had never occurred to my son that the sun in this particular universe was something I controlled. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the diner booth until 5 in the morning when Rena's started filling with early shift workers and the first gray light appeared in the windows, and then I walked to a drugstore 2 blocks over that had just opened and bought a travel toothbrush and a cheap pair of gloves, and stood in the restroom for 15 minutes, making myself look like a man who hadn't spent the night on a park bench and in a diner booth. I did not do this perfectly, but I did it well enough. Margaret Ellison's office was in a building downtown that had been in the same location for 38 years. The lobby still had the same dark wood paneling that Owen Ellison had installed, which Margaret had kept because she said wood that old deserved to stay where it was. I had always liked that about her. Her assistant, a composed young man named Paul, took one look at me when I walked in at 8:55 and did not react to whatever he saw on my face, which was professionally correct of him and which I was grateful for. "Mr. Whitmore, Ms. Ellison is expecting you. Can I get you coffee?" "Please," I said. Margaret came out to meet me herself rather than making me wait in her office, which I noticed. She was 68, silver-haired, with the kind of direct gaze that had probably made opposing counsel uncomfortable for 4 decades. She looked at me the way she always looked at me, with attention, not performance. "Harold," she said. She didn't say you looked terrible, though I imagine she could see it plainly enough. She just took my hand in both of hers for a moment. "Come in." We sat across from each other at the small table she kept near the window, rather than at her formal desk, which was her signal that this was going to be a real conversation and not a billable hour transaction. "Tell me what happened," she said. I told her. Not everything. Not all the small erosions, not the brochures on the breakfast table, not Sandra in Eleanor's garden. I gave her the shape of it, the essential facts. Derek wanted me out. He'd given me 12 days. I had left the house last night. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was both her professional training and, I had always believed, her actual nature. When I finished, there was a brief silence. "Where did you sleep last night?" she said. "I didn't," I said. "A diner." She pressed her lips together. Not pity. Something colder and more useful than pity. "All right," she said. "Then let me tell you exactly where we stand." She opened a folder that was already on the table, which meant she had pulled the trust documents before I arrived, which meant my call last night had told her more than just the question I'd asked. "The Whitmore family trust is completely intact," she said. "The assets have grown significantly since your father established it. The commercial property alone has roughly tripled in appraised value, and the investment portfolio has been conservatively managed. Total current value is something we can run precisely, but we're talking about a number well above 8 figures. I knew the approximate number. I hadn't looked at it closely in a while because there had been no reason to. That was another thing I was beginning to understand about the years since Derek moved in. I had gradually stopped paying attention to my own affairs, as if the act of ceding space had extended, without my noticing, into ceding oversight. "And the trustee designation," I said. "Unchanged," Margaret said. She turned a page in the folder and pushed it across the table toward me. "Your father was very specific. The trustee authority is yours for the duration of your lifetime, with succession naming your designated heir only upon your death or a documented incapacity determination by 2 independent physicians. Derek is named as primary beneficiary, yes, but beneficiary and trustee are not the same thing." "He doesn't know the difference," I said. "No," Margaret agreed. "Most people don't, until it matters." I looked at the document. My father's handwriting was in the margin of 1 page, a notation he'd made during the drafting process, which Margaret had preserved because it was part of the original. Even after 32 years, I recognized it. Small and precise, the handwriting of a man who measured twice. "He's been living on distributions," I said, not a question. "Yes," Margaret said carefully. "Over the past 4 years, there have been regular distribution requests that you have authorized. Quarterly. The amounts have increased each year." I looked up at her. "I authorized them?" She met my eyes steadily. "Your signature appears on each authorization. I will note that the requests were submitted through the administrative process, and they were accompanied by proper documentation." A pause. "However, now that you've raised it, I'd like to review those authorizations with you directly." Something cold moved through me. Not the cold of the January night. Something interior. "Margaret," I said slowly, "I need you to tell me how much Derek's lifestyle currently depends on those distributions." She took a breath. "Harold, the disbursements represent a significant portion of his operating liquidity. His business ventures carry considerable debt. The investment positions he's taken on over the past 3 years are leveraged in ways that require consistent cash flow to service." She chose her next words carefully. "If the distributions were to stop, or even to be delayed by a quarter, the pressure on his financial structure would be substantial." The room was very quiet. "How substantial?" I said. "Enough to create a cascade," she said. "His creditors are not patient people." I sat back in my chair. I thought about Derek standing in my bedroom doorway with his rehearsed speech and his Sandra-approved language and his 12-day deadline. I thought about Sandra calling me a burden in Eleanor's garden. I thought about what my father had said. Money has a memory. "I want to review everything," I said. "Every authorization from the past 4 years, every distribution request, everything." Margaret nodded slowly. That's your right as trustee, she said. Absolutely, you're right. And Margaret, I stopped. If we find what I think we're going to find, let's look first, she said. One thing at a time. Begged. We spent 6 hours in that office. Paul brought sandwiches at noon that neither of us finished. Margaret's associate, a careful young woman named Christine, pulled records and cross-referenced accounts and placed documents in chronological order across the conference table until the table disappeared under paper. What we found was not, in the legal sense, fraud. I need to be precise about that. Derek had not forged my signature. He had not fabricated documents. What he had done was something more patient, more architectural, a slow process of becoming indispensable to my administrative life until the authorizations arrived in my hands as routine paperwork in a stack that Sandra had organized, in a household routine that Sandra had structured, in a life that had been gradually managed until I was signing things I was reading but not fully absorbing because I had been so thoroughly made to feel like a guest in my own existence that I had stopped paying sharp attention to the things that were still, by rights, entirely mine. The distributions had been going to an account in Derek's business structure, not to a personal account, to the business, which made it look like standard investment management. But the business was, on examination, a vehicle that spent rather than produced. The money flowed in from the trust and flowed out into a lifestyle. The house renovations, Sandra's consulting firm that earned little but spent considerably, the cars, the private school for the grandchildren, the dinners with clients like Gareth Bryce. Derek had built his entire financial reality on a foundation he did not own, and he had done it so seamlessly, so gradually, that I had barely noticed I was funding it. He thinks it's already his, I said. I was looking at a distribution summary from the previous year. The number was not small. Margaret was quiet for a moment. People have a way of believing what benefits them, she said. He was never going to tell me, I said. He was going to wait until I was in a senior community somewhere signing whatever paperwork he put in front of me, and eventually... Harold, Margaret's voice was careful. We don't need to speculate about intent. What we have in front of us is fact, and the fact is that you are the trustee. Every decision made from this point forward is yours. I looked at the documents spread across the table. 32 years of my father's careful architecture, my signature on papers I had processed like a man sleepwalking. Derek's business reports that told a story of success built on a river of money that I controlled and had never fully understood. I controlled. I was angry. I want to be honest about that. I was angry in the way that takes a while to arrive, but once it's there, it's immovable. The kind of anger that doesn't shout. It plans. But I was also, underneath the anger, something else. Something I hadn't expected. I was ashamed. Because I had let this happen. Not entirely, not without provocation, not without being systematically softened and managed and reduced, but I had let it happen. I had signed papers without reading them closely. I had accepted a diminished position in my own life without fighting back because I was tired and grieving, and I had confused the feeling of peace with the reality of defeat. I had abandoned my own post. That shame was useful, though. It was a different kind of fuel from the anger. What are my options? I said. Margaret folded her hands on the table. You can modify the distribution structure at any time. You can pause distributions pending a review. You can add conditions, requirements for transparency, documentation standards that must be met before any future authorization is processed. She paused. You can also, if you determine it's warranted, pursue a formal review of how the existing distributions were represented to you. I don't want to pursue anything yet, I said. I want to watch. Margaret looked at me. Derek doesn't know I've been here, I said. He doesn't know what I know. He thinks I stopped. I almost said he thinks I'm beaten. He thinks the situation is what it looks like from his side. And what does it look like from his side? Margaret said. An old man with nowhere to go and 12 days to find somewhere, I said. A moment of quiet. What do you need right now? Margaret said. Practically speaking. I thought about it. A place to stay, I said. Frank's, probably. He's been asking me to visit for months, and I've been putting it off because I stopped. Because I kept thinking things would improve. Because I kept giving Derek one more chance to be the son I believed he still was somewhere inside. Because leaving felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. And beyond that, Margaret said, "Time," I said. "I need a little time." What I didn't tell Margaret, because I wasn't yet sure of it myself, was that I also needed to grieve something. Not Eleanor. I had done that grieving, painfully and imperfectly, over years. What I needed to grieve was the version of Derek I had kept alive in my mind well past the point where the evidence supported it. The boy on my shoulders at the fair. The young man I had believed in and invested in and defended to people who raised their eyebrows. That Derek was not the man in my bedroom with his 12-day deadline and his carefully rehearsed language. I had to stop confusing the two. Charmed. Frank lived 3 hours upstate in a house he'd shared with his wife Carol for 34 years, a wide green property with a creek running along the eastern edge that froze every winter and thawed every spring with a reliability that Frank found comforting and that I had always slightly envied. Frank was the opposite of me in most ways, slower, more patient, content with smaller things. And our relationship over the years had been the particular warmth of two people who love each other precisely because they don't understand each other completely. I called him from the parking garage below Margaret's building. He answered in 2 rings. "Harold, it's the middle of the afternoon on a Thursday." "I know," I said. "Frank, I need to come stay with you for a while." Silence. Not the silence of reluctance, the silence of a man recalibrating quickly. "How long is a while?" he said. "I don't know yet." Another silence. "Does this have to do with Derek?" "Yes," I said. "I'll have Carol make up the room," he said. No questions. No, I told you so, though Frank had told me, in the quiet way he had of telling you things without quite saying them directly, multiple times over the past 3 years. "How soon can you get here?" "I need to go back to the house first," I said. "Get some things." "Harold," his voice changed. "Be careful." "I will be." "I don't mean physically," he said. I knew what he meant. He meant be careful of Derek's particular skill at making you feel like the problem was with you. He meant be careful of Sandra's efficiency and the way she could restructure a confrontation until you were defending yourself instead of your position. He meant be careful of your own love for your son and how it had been used against you. "I know," I said. "I will be." I went back to the house in the early afternoon while Derek was at his office, and Sandra, I calculated, would be at her twice-weekly lunch with her business partner. I had learned those rhythms over 3 years of being a background presence in the household. I knew the schedule of my own home better than its current occupants probably realized. Marcus and Lily were at school. The housekeeper, a quiet woman named Gloria, who had worked there for 4 years and had always treated me with a respect that felt genuine, was doing laundry in the basement. When I came through the front door, she appeared at the top of the basement stairs and looked at me with the careful blankness of someone who had witnessed things she had opinions about but was paid not to voice. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Gloria," I said. "I'm just getting some of my things." She nodded. "Your mail is on the hall table," she said. "There was some that looked important." "Thank you," I said. I went upstairs and I packed 2 bags. I took my clothes, my books, the photograph from my bedside table. Eleanor and me at Niagara Falls, 1987, both of us younger than Marcus was now, laughing at something one of us had said that I could no longer remember, but that the photograph always made me feel was still recoverable somehow. I took my documents from the fireproof box under the bed. I took the notebook Marcus had given me 2 Christmases ago that I had been writing in inconsistently. Small observations, memories, the kind of thing you start doing when you become aware that your memory for detail is not what it was, and you want to keep certain things. I took the blue notebook I had bought for Marcus and left it on his pillow with a note that said simply, "For your stories. I love them. Grandpa." I stood in the doorway of his room for a moment, his books in crooked stacks, a drawing of a dinosaur taped to the wall, the specific disorder of a 10-year-old who is not worried about neatness because he has not yet learned that the world will require it of him. I went downstairs. I put my bags by the front door. I went to the kitchen and I wrote 2 notes, one for Derek, one for Sandra. I kept them short. I told them I was staying with Frank for a while. I told them I would be in contact through my attorney regarding next steps. I told them that I expected no further communication from them without going through Margaret's office. I signed both notes with my full name, Harold James Whitmore. Not Dad, not Harold. My full name, the way you sign a document when you want the weight of formality behind it. I left the notes on the kitchen counter where Sandra's brochures had been. Then I picked up my bags, said goodbye to Gloria, who was standing quietly in the kitchen doorway, and who said, "Take care of yourself, Mr. Whitmore," in a voice that carried more warmth than my own son had offered me in 3 years, and I walked out of that house. I didn't know then exactly what I was going to do next. I had the beginning of an understanding, the trust, the distributions, the authority I had nearly forgotten I held. I had Margaret in my corner and Frank's house to sleep in, and the slow-building clarity of a man who has finally stopped sleepwalking. But I also had something Derek didn't know about and wouldn't see coming, because in all his careful watching, all his strategic positioning, he had made the same mistake that people always make when they underestimate someone. He had confused my silence with surrender. He had looked at a 72-year-old man who ate breakfast alone and watched television in his room and flinched when his daughter-in-law called him a burden, and he had decided that man was finished. He didn't know his grandfather's voice the way I did. He didn't know what Chester Whitmore had built, or why, or what it was designed to withstand. He didn't know that the money he had built his whole life on could stop with a single phone call to Margaret. But he was about to find out. Frank's guest room had a window that faced east, and every morning for 3 weeks I woke up to the kind of light that doesn't ask anything of you, just comes in quiet and yellow across the floor and lets you be a person again before the day requires anything more specific. I needed those mornings more than I knew how to say. Frank and Carol didn't hover. That was the gift they gave me. They let me exist in their house without requiring me to perform recovery. Carol made extra food at dinner and left it in containers in the refrigerator without comment. Frank sat with me in the evenings sometimes and we'd watch television or play chess badly, the way we'd always played. Frank too patient, me too aggressive, neither of us winning cleanly. We talked around the edges of what had happened. Frank knew enough. He didn't need a full accounting. One night, about a week in, he set down his chess piece and said, "You know I saw it coming." "I know," I said. "I didn't say anything because—" "Frank!" I looked at him. "I know, it's all right." He picked up his piece again. "What are you going to do?" "I'm working on it," I said. That was both completely true and the largest understatement I had managed in recent memory. Because what I was working on, what Margaret and I had been building through phone calls and document reviews and careful, deliberate planning, was not a response. It was a reckoning. The preparation took 3 weeks, and it was not clean or simple or remotely satisfying in the way that plans in movies are satisfying, where everything snaps into place with precision and everyone says exactly what they're supposed to say. Real life is messier than that. People are messier. Margaret and I went through every distribution record from the past 4 years. Christine, her associate, created a timeline that tracked exactly when the requests had come in, how they had been presented to me, and how they compared to the original terms my father had established. The picture that emerged was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was methodical. Derek had increased the draw on the trust gradually enough that no single jump was alarming, but the cumulative effect over 4 years was that he had extracted nearly 40% more annually than the trust's original distribution guidelines anticipated. Not illegal, but built on a fundamental misrepresentation, the assumption, which Derek had actively allowed me to hold, that these were routine administrative distributions rather than the financial spine of his entire operation. Margaret wanted me to file a formal complaint. I told her not yet. "Why?" she said. We were on the phone a Tuesday evening. "Harold, you have standing. You have documentation." "Because I want him to know," I said. "I don't want it to happen through paperwork. I want to be in the room." A pause. "That's not always wise," she said. "No," I agreed. "But it's what I need." She was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll do it your way," she said. "But I want Christine there, and I want to choose the location." Fine, I said. The location she chose was her conference room, which was correct. Neutral ground, professional setting, no ambiguity about the nature of the meeting. She sent a formal letter to Derek's business address requesting his attendance at a trust review meeting, citing her authority as the Trust's Oversight Council. The letter was precisely worded to sound administrative rather than confrontational. A routine review, it said, in light of the trustee's recent change of residence and a periodic assessment of distribution structures. Derek called Margaret's office 2 hours after the letter arrived. Paul put him through to Christine, who was prepared, and who told him, very calmly, that the meeting was a standard procedural requirement and that his attendance was requested but not legally compelled, though his failure to attend would be noted in the trust record. Derek attended. He brought Sandra. Margaret, in a separate call to me, said she had expected as much. I arrived at Margaret's office 20 minutes early, not because I was nervous exactly, but because I needed the time to sit in the parking structure and do what I had started calling, in my head, the accounting. Not financial accounting. The other kind. I sat in Frank's car. He had lent it to me without being asked, just handed me the keys one morning and said he didn't need it that week. And I thought about what I wanted to accomplish in that room. Not what I was going to say, what I wanted to accomplish. I was not there to punish Derek. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to frame what followed as revenge, and revenge is too clean a word for what I was feeling. I was there because I had spent 3 years becoming someone I didn't recognize, and the only way to stop being that person was to stand in a room and be completely truthful about what had happened, to myself as much as to anyone else. I was also there because Derek needed to know the truth, not as a weapon, as a fact. Because a man who doesn't know the true structure of his life cannot make real choices about it, and whatever I thought of my son's choices over the past 3 years, I was not prepared to let him continue building on sand without telling him the sand was there. That might sound generous. It wasn't entirely. There was anger in it too. I went upstairs at 5 to 9. Derek and Sandra were already in the conference room when Margaret led me in. They were seated on one side of the table, and the sight of them sitting together, Sandra in a gray blazer, Derek in the suit he wore when he wanted to project competence, hit me differently than I expected. Not with renewed hurt, with something more like distance. The distance of a man who has been away long enough to see clearly. Derek looked up when I came in. Something crossed his face that was too quick to read. Sandra's expression remained neutral with the kind of discipline that required practice. "Harold," Derek said. He started to stand, then seemed to think better of it and stayed seated. "I didn't know you were... Margaret didn't say you'd be here." "I didn't specify," Margaret said. She sat at the head of the table. Christine sat beside her with a laptop and the document files. I sat across from Derek and Sandra. The room was very quiet for a moment. "So," Derek said. He clasped his hands on the table in front of him. "This is a trust review." "Yes," Margaret said. "Thank you both for coming. This meeting is being documented as part of the formal trust record." She looked at Sandra, then Derek. "Do either of you have legal representation you'd like to have present?" A flicker of something in Derek's eyes. "That won't be necessary," he said. "This is a family matter." "It is both," Margaret said, with the particular pleasantness of a lawyer who has won arguments before breakfast. "But we'll proceed on your preference." She opened the folder in front of her and began. She walked through the trust's basic structure, the establishment date, the asset composition, the distribution guidelines my father had set. She was clear and she was measured, and she gave Derek no particular opportunity to interrupt because she didn't leave spaces for interruption. Derek listened. I watched him listening. I watched the moment he began to understand that this was not, in fact, a routine administrative meeting. It was around the time Margaret reached the distribution analysis, the 4-year timeline, the escalating numbers, that his posture changed. Subtle. His shoulders pulled back slightly, his jaw tightened. "These are authorized distributions," he said. "You have my father's signature on everyone." "We do," Margaret said. "Christine, would you put up the comparison document?" Christine turned her laptop screen to face Derek and Sandra. The document showed the distributions alongside the trust's original guideline figures. 2 columns. The gap between them told the story more clearly than any explanation could. Sandra was the first to speak. She leaned forward slightly, and her voice was the careful voice she used when she was reassessing a situation in real time. Margaret, I think there may be some confusion about how those figures are being interpreted. The distributions were commensurate with the trust's growth. Any increase reflects appropriate adjustment for Sandra, I said. She stopped. She looked at me. I didn't think I'd spoken in that voice since Eleanor's funeral, when the caterers tried to change the menu at the last minute and I'd had enough of things being changed without my consent. Let Margaret finish, I said. Sandra looked at me for a moment. Something in her expression recalibrated. She sat back. Margaret continued. She explained the trustee authority structure. She explained what sole trustee meant, not as a technicality, but as a practice, in operational terms, in terms of what it meant for every decision that had been made and every decision that would be made going forward. Derek was very still by the time she finished. I control it, I said. I hadn't planned to say it that way, just those 3 words, but they were the right words. Everything in that trust, Derek, every distribution you've received, every authorization, all of it required my sign-off, and all of it can stop with mine. Derek looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had not seen in 3 years. Not anger, not calculation. Something rawer than that. Something that looked almost like the person he used to be before Sandra and the business and the long systematic project of becoming someone who didn't need me anymore. Dad, he started. Don't, I said. Not yet. Listen first. He closed his mouth. Your business is leveraged against those distributions, I said. Margaret has reviewed your structure. I know what your creditors look like. I know what your cash flow looks like without the quarterly transfers. I paused. I know everything, Derek, and I need you to understand that, not as a threat, but as a fact. The life you've been living is not built on your success. It's built on your grandfather's money, and your grandfather's money moves when I say it moves. The room was very quiet. Sandra spoke first. Of course she did. Harold, I understand you're upset about how things were handled regarding your living situation, and I want to say that I am genuinely sorry if our communication, if, I said. She stopped. You called me a burden, I said. In my own garden. You planned a dinner and told me to stay in my room like a child. You put brochures for retirement homes on my breakfast table every morning for 2 months. My voice was steady. I had practiced being steady. You organized this with Derek months before they said a word to me. I know that too. Sandra looked at me. The careful neutrality in her face was doing a great deal of work. I'm not here to punish you, I said. I'm here because my son needs to understand the truth about his situation, and I am the only one in a position to tell it to him. I looked at Derek. Your grandfather built something, I said, and he built it the way he did because he understood something about family that I spent too long refusing to believe. He understood that love and money are not the same thing, that you cannot assume loyalty, that you protect what matters because the people you love are human beings, and human beings under pressure make choices you can't always predict. Derek's jaw was working. Dad, You signed my name to a life that depended on something you didn't own, I said. You built your business on a foundation you never fully understood because you never asked. You moved into my house, and you and your wife spent 3 years making me smaller and smaller until I was a man, eating cold cuts alone in a bedroom while you used Eleanor's crystal downstairs. And then you gave me 12 days to get out. My voice broke slightly on Eleanor's name. I didn't try to stop it. And none of that was because you're a monster, Derek. It was because you looked at me and you decided I was finished. You decided I was a resource that had already been fully depleted. Derek looked down at the table. Look at me, I said. He looked up. His eyes were wet. I had not seen my son cry since Eleanor's funeral. The sight of it broke something in me and repaired something else in the same instant. I am 72 years old, I said. I slept in a diner booth the night you told me to leave because I had nowhere to go. A diner booth, Derek. After everything. My voice was quiet now, not performative, just tired and real. And I sat there and I thought about your grandfather and what he built and why. And I understood for the first time that he wasn't being cynical when he built it the way he did. He was being loving. He was protecting me from exactly this. The room held the silence for a long moment. Then Derek said very quietly, "What happens now?" I looked at Margaret. "The quarterly distribution that was due this week," Margaret said, "has been placed on administrative hold pending the outcome of this review. That is Mr. Whitmore's prerogative as trustee." Derek's head came up sharply. "For how long?" "That depends," Margaret said, "on a number of things. My creditors," Derek started. "I know about your creditors," I said. His face changed. "Dad, if the distribution doesn't process by Friday, Bryce pulls out of the deal. The whole Eastern Development Project collapses. I have people depending on that." "I know," I said. "You can't just—" "Derek." My voice was firm and quiet. "I can. That's the point. I can." Silence. Sandra's composure finally cracked slightly at the edges. "This is— Harold, this is coercive. You're using the trust as leverage over— Sandra." Margaret's voice was pleasant and final. "I'd recommend thinking carefully before continuing that sentence." Sandra stopped. I looked at my son who had Eleanor's nose and my father's chin and 30 years of choices layered over a person I had once known completely. He looked exhausted. He looked, for the first time in years, like someone who had been holding something very heavy and had just realized he couldn't hold it anymore. Part of me wanted to reach across the table. Part of me was that father, the one who drove him to school and taught him to drive and wrote the check when the bank said no. But the check-writing father had put a man on a park bench in January. That father had been wrong in the specific way that loving too much without boundaries is always wrong. It looks like generosity from the inside, and it looks like an open door to the wrong kind of people. "There are going to be conditions," I said. "Margaret will present them formally. Some of them are about the trust. Some of them are about the house and your living situation going forward. Some of them are about documentation and oversight that should have existed from the beginning and didn't because I was asleep." I paused. "If you meet those conditions, genuinely, not performatively, then we talk about the future, about what a real arrangement looks like, about what I'm willing to do and what I'm not." I looked at him steadily. "But I need you to understand something first, Derek. This is not negotiable. Not the oversight, not the conditions, not the fact that this trust is mine to manage for the rest of my life. The only question is whether you want to work within that reality honestly, or whether you want to continue operating under the illusion that I was finished." Derek's hands were flat on the table. He was looking at them. "I'm not finished," I said. "I was never finished. I was just quiet." And then Sandra did something I had not expected from her. She reached over and put her hand over Derek's on the table, and it wasn't the calculated gesture she usually deployed. It was something smaller and more honest than that, a woman recognizing that the structure she had helped build was standing on nothing and being frightened by it. Derek looked up at me. His eyes were still wet. "I didn't think—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't think about what I was doing to you. I told myself it was practical, that you'd be better off in a smaller space, that we needed room, that the arrangement wasn't working." His voice was unsteady. "I told myself it made sense." "I know," I said. And I did. That was the hardest part. I knew exactly how a person talks themselves into something. I had done it too, in the other direction. I had talked myself into believing that staying quiet was keeping the peace, that making myself small was being gracious, that absorbing each new reduction was an act of love. We had both been telling ourselves stories. "The distributions," Derek said. "If they stop, they're already stopped," I said. "As of this morning." He closed his eyes. "Friday," he said. "Dad, Bryce—" "I know about Bryce," I said. "I know about the Eastern Development Project. I know the numbers, Derek. Margaret knows the numbers." I stood up. My knees ached, the way they always did now when I'd been sitting for a while. I was 72 years old, and my son had put me in a diner booth, and somewhere in the past 3 weeks, I had stopped being ashamed of saying that plainly. "You have some calls to make," I said. "So do I." "We'll talk again in a week," through Margaret, and we'll see where we are. I walked to the door. Christine held it open. Behind me, I heard Derek say my name once more. Not Dad this time. Harold. The way he used to say it when he was small, and I was leaving for work, and he wanted me to stop for one more minute. I stopped. I didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was rough and unfinished, and I believed it in the way you believe something that's too broken to be strategic. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know it's not enough." The room was very still. "No," I said, "it's not." And I walked out. The drive back to Frank's took 40 minutes, and I cried for about 10 of them, somewhere on the highway between the city and the county line, pulled over on the shoulder with the hazards on, because my eyes were blurring enough that driving felt irresponsible. I cried for Eleanor, who had not lived to see this, and who would have known exactly what to say to Derek in that conference room, something I never would have thought of, something that would have cut directly to whatever was left of his heart. I cried for the 11 years in that house, and the gradual erosion of myself that I had allowed, and the cold bench in the park, and the bad coffee, and the chip on the diner mug. I cried for Marcus and Lily, who were at school right now drawing pictures and writing stories, and had no idea that their family had just fractured in a conference room downtown. And then I stopped crying, because the highway was still there, and Frank's house was still 40 minutes away, and I had things to do. The hold on the distributions was real. By the following morning, Derek's business accounts would begin to reflect the absence of that quarterly transfer. His creditors, specifically a financing firm called Meridian Capital, whose name had appeared 3 times in the documents Christine compiled, would begin calling by Friday if the payment didn't clear. What Derek didn't know yet was that I had already contacted Meridian Capital myself, through Margaret, to inform them of the trustee review and the administrative hold, not to torpedo the deal. To be honest, something no one in this situation had been for a very long time. There were going to be consequences, real ones. Some of them were going to hurt. That was not something I could prevent, and it was not something I was trying to prevent anymore. What I was trying to prevent was the continuation of a lie. The lie that I was finished. The lie that the money belonged to Derek by default. The lie that an old man with no fight left in him was something you could simply move around to make more room for yourself. I pulled back onto the highway. Somewhere behind me, in a conference room in a building downtown, my son was sitting across from his wife trying to understand how the ground had come out from under him. I drove north toward Frank's house, toward Carol's cooking and the chessboard and the window that faced east, and I thought about my father and what he knew and what he had left me. Not just the money, not just the trust, but the understanding that dignity is not given to you. You have to be willing to hold it yourself. The week after the conference room was the longest week I can remember, since the 6 weeks between Eleanor's diagnosis and her death. Different kind of long sit, not grief exactly, but the particular exhaustion of waiting for consequences to arrive when you know they're coming and you can't stop them, and you're not entirely sure you'd want to, even if you could. Meridian Capital called Derek on Thursday. Margaret's assistant Paul told me, relaying a message Margaret had left before an early court appearance. 3 words in the message: "It has started." I was sitting at Frank's kitchen table when Paul called, drinking coffee that was considerably better than the diner's, looking out the window at the frozen creek. Frank was in the other room. I didn't tell him what the message said. I just sat there with my coffee and watched the ice on the water and thought about the particular silence that comes just before something falls. Friday arrived and the Bryce deal collapsed exactly as Derek had predicted it would. I know this because Christine sent me a summary. Margaret had arranged for me to receive relevant updates, and because Derek called my cell phone 4 times between 9 and 11 in the morning. I let each call go to voicemail. I wasn't ready, not yet. I needed to know what I was dealing with before I let his voice into my ear. I listened to the voicemails in order, sitting in Frank's car in the driveway, because I wanted to be alone. The first message was controlled. Derek's business voice, the competent one he used with clients. "Dad, I need to talk to you. The Bryce situation has escalated, and I need you to understand the timeline here. Please call me." The second message, 2 hours later, was less controlled. Something underneath the professional surface was starting to show. "Dad, It's Derek. Meridian is threatening to pull the credit facility. I have employees, I have projects mid-construction. This isn't just about me. Please. The third message, around noon, was different. The business voice was entirely gone. What was left was something I recognized from when Derek was 14 and had crashed the car and called me from a gas station payphone, scared and trying not to sound it. Dad, I need you to pick up. I know what I did. I know how this looks, but I can't handle this without talking to you. Please just call me. The fourth message was 3 minutes long and mostly silence, and then Derek saying very quietly, I don't know what to do, and then the click of him hanging up. I sat in Frank's car for a long time after that. I am not going to pretend I felt nothing hearing those messages. I am not going to construct a version of myself that was so wronged and so resolved that my son's voice asking for help didn't reach anything in me. That would be a lie, and lies are what got all of us here. I felt it. I felt every word of that third message in the particular place that fatherhood lives, the place that doesn't close all the way no matter what happens, the place that remembers a 14-year-old at a gas station payphone and a man who drove 40 minutes in the rain without anger because his son needed him. But feeling it and acting on it immediately were two different things. That was the lesson I had spent 3 years failing to learn and 3 weeks at Frank's house beginning to understand. Love is not the same as capitulation. Caring about someone's pain does not mean removing every consequence of their choices. I had confused those two things for decades, and the confusion had cost me a park bench in January. I called Margaret instead of Derek. He's in serious trouble, I said. Yes, she said. Meridian is calling the credit facility. Bryce has formally withdrawn. He has 2 other investors who are watching the situation and will likely follow. How bad is it? Without trust distributions and without the Bryce deal, his liquidity position is very difficult, she said. He has assets, equity in the house, some investment positions, but they're not liquid. If Meridian accelerates the debt, he'll need to sell something significant. I absorbed that. The house, I said. It's the largest asset in his name, Margaret said carefully. My house. Eleanor's house. The house with the photograph on the stairwell wall and Marcus's drawings in his room and the rose beds in the garden I had been trying to maintain for 11 years because it made me feel close to something I had lost. What are the trust conditions we've proposed? I said. Christine sent the draft this morning, Margaret said. Did you review it? Not yet, I said. Walk me through it. She did. It took 20 minutes. The conditions Margaret and I had developed over the previous week were structured around 3 principles: transparency, accountability, and protection. Future distributions would require quarterly financial reporting from Derek's business, reviewed by an independent accountant. The amounts would return to the original guidelines my father had set, not the inflated figures of the past 4 years. Derek's access to trust information would be formalized. He would receive regular statements showing the trust's health and his status as beneficiary, but with no ambiguity about the distinction between beneficiary and trustee. And there was a conduct provision, which was the one I had insisted on despite Margaret's caution about its enforceability. A written acknowledgement of what had happened, not for legal purposes but for the record, because I needed something documented that said my son understood what he had done. He'll sign the financial conditions, Margaret said. He has no real choice. The conduct acknowledgement is where I expect resistance. From Derek or from Sandra? A brief pause. Both, she said. For different reasons. Sandra will see it as liability exposure, I said. Yes. And Derek will see it as humiliation. Also yes. I thought about that. I thought about what I actually wanted from the acknowledgement. Not a legal weapon, not a document to brandish. Just the truth, written down, by the person who owed it to me. Sometimes that matters. Sometimes having a person say in writing what they did to you is the only way you can fully believe it happened, because the alternative, moving forward without it, feels too much like agreeing that it didn't. Tell Christine to hold it in the draft, I said. Don't remove it. Understood, Margaret said. But Potier. Derek came to Frank's house 4 days later. He came alone, which told me something, that either Sandra didn't know he was coming or that he had made a choice to come without her, which would be the first significant choice he'd made without Sandra's architecture around it in several years. Frank opened the door and then came to find me in the back room where I'd been reading, and he said, "Your son is on the porch," with the expression of a man who has been waiting to say those words for a while and is reserving his opinion about what should happen next. "Okay," I said. I set my book down. "You want me to stay?" Frank said. "No," I said. "Thank you." I walked through the house to the front porch. Derek was standing on the steps, not sitting in one of the chairs, which meant he hadn't assumed he was welcome to sit. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and he looked like he hadn't slept well in several days, which was probably accurate. He looked like my son in a way he hadn't looked in a long time. Not the managed, competent version, but the actual person underneath it. I stood in the doorway. I didn't open the storm door immediately. We looked at each other through the glass for a moment. Then I opened it. "It's cold," I said. "Come in." He came in. We sat in Frank's living room, across from each other, the way we'd sat in my sitting room what felt like a very long time ago. Except now neither of us had the furniture of that life around us, and there was no Sandra in the doorway, and there was no pretense left that I could see. Derek said, "I had to let 2 people go yesterday." I said nothing. "Project managers?" he said. "Good people. One of them has a kid starting college next year." He looked at his hands. I sat across from them and I told them, and I couldn't explain why. I couldn't tell them the real reason. He paused. That was the worst part. Sitting there, knowing that what happened to them happened because of what I did to you. "Yes," I said. "That's how consequences work. They don't stay contained." He flinched slightly. "I know." "Do you?" I said. "Because I don't think you did know. I think you thought that what you were doing was contained, that it was a family arrangement that didn't affect anyone outside of it." I leaned forward slightly. "But you built a business on that foundation, Derek. You hired people and made deals and positioned yourself in a market based on liquidity that wasn't yours. They were always going to be downstream of this." Derek was quiet for a long moment. "I told myself—" He stopped. "I know what you told yourself," I said. "I've been trying to understand it. I think you told yourself that the money would always be there because you could not afford to examine too closely whether that was actually true. I think you made yourself not look." He looked up. "That's—" He stopped again. Started differently. "Yes," he said. "That's what I did." The honesty of it was painful. Not satisfying the way I had sometimes, in weaker moments, imagined it might be painful. Just sad. My son admitting he had looked away from something important because looking at it would have required him to change. "Sandra thinks I shouldn't have come," he said. "I know," I said. "She thinks I should wait for Margaret to present the formal conditions and respond through our attorney." He shook his head slightly. "She's probably right, tactically." "She usually is," I said. "Tactically." A long pause. "Dad," Derek said, and his voice was rough, "what do you need from me? Not legally, not through attorneys. What do you actually need?" I had thought about this question. Not just for this conversation. I had been thinking about it since the diner booth, since the park bench, since the sitting room when he had walked out mid-conversation 3 months ago. What did I need? Not want. Need. "I need you to understand that what you did was not a misunderstanding," I said. "It was not a failure of communication. It was a series of choices you made over several years, some of them with Sandra's help, to reduce me to a position where I could not effectively protect my own interests." My voice was steady. I was grateful for that. "You did not do it maliciously, I think. I don't believe you woke up every morning planning to harm me. But you chose your comfort over my dignity again and again, until my dignity was almost gone. And I need you to know that I know that. Not just that it happened, that you chose it." Derek's jaw was working. "Yes," he said. "Say it," I said. He looked at me. "I chose it," he said. "I knew what was happening to you in that house, and I told myself it was fine, that you were comfortable, that it was practical." His voice broke on the last word. "It wasn't fine." I knew it wasn't fine, and I kept choosing it because changing it would have cost me something. I sat back. Something released in me. Not forgiveness, not yet. Something earlier than forgiveness. Something like the first breath after holding it too long. The conduct acknowledgement in Margaret's conditions, I said. Sandra says, I know what Sandra says, I said. I'm asking what you say. He was quiet. Derek, I said, I am not asking for that document to use against you. I am asking for it because I need to know that there exists somewhere a piece of paper that says the truth. That's all. I've been living in a house full of comfortable untruths for 3 years. I need one true thing written down. He looked at me for a long time. I'll sign it, he said. Whatever it says. You should read it first, I said. I'll read it and I'll sign it, he said. We sat in that for a moment. Outside, Frank's frozen creek was catching the last of the afternoon light, going silver through the window. Then Derek said, quietly, I need to sell the house, don't I? It wasn't really a question. Probably, I said. Without the distribution increase, your debt service doesn't work. Margaret can run the scenarios, but I've already run them, he said. 3 nights in a row. He rubbed the side of his face. Sandra doesn't know yet. I haven't been able to tell her. I thought about Sandra learning that the house she had redecorated, the house she had managed, the house from which she had sent me to my room like a child, was going to have to be sold to cover debts built on money she had assumed was already theirs. I did not feel satisfaction about that. I want to be honest. I felt something more complicated, something that acknowledged Sandra's genuine intelligence and capability, and the waste of both in the service of something that had hurt everyone it touched, including, eventually, her. What about Marcus and Lily? I said. Derek's face changed. That was the truest thing on his face, his love for his children. That had never been in question. They'll be okay, he said, but his voice was thin. It'll be hard on them. A smaller place, new schools probably if we move districts. He stopped. Marcus was asking about you the other day. I hadn't seen Marcus or Lily since the night I left. That absence had been the sharpest thing, sharper even than the park bench and the diner booth, because children don't participate in the choices that separate them from people who love them. They just experience the separation. What did he say? I said. He asked why you weren't at his concert, Derek said. He said he looked for you in the audience. I had to look away for a moment, out the window, at the Silver Creek. He saved the program, Derek said. He put it on the kitchen counter with your name written on the back. I don't know why. He didn't say. I pressed my hand flat against my knee and held it there and waited for the moment to pass. I want to see them, I said. My voice was not entirely steady. I know, Derek said. I should have made sure that never stopped. That was wrong. Whatever was happening between us, that was wrong. Yes, I said. It was. We sat in the quiet for a while. Not a comfortable quiet, not yet. Too much between us for comfortable, but a real one. The quiet of two people who have stopped pretending, which is different from peace, but is at least the beginning of something honest. Derek left an hour later. At the door, he stopped with his hand on the frame, and he didn't turn around when he said, I know it doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry. For all of it. The specific things and the general. All of it. I know, I said. He nodded once and left. I went back inside and stood in Frank's hallway and listened to the car pull away, and then Frank appeared from the kitchen because he had, of course, been no further than the kitchen the entire time. Well, he said. Well, I said. He handed me a cup of coffee, and we went to sit in the back room again, and we didn't talk much. And that was exactly right. The consequences came steadily over the following weeks, the way real consequences do. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of smaller ones that accumulate into a new reality. Derek listed the house in late February. The market was slow, and the price had to be adjusted twice before they got an offer. I know this not because Derek told me, but because Margaret monitored the public listing and kept me informed, and because Frank mentioned it once in the way Frank mentioned things he thought I should know but didn't want to make into a moment. The Meridian Capital situation was resolved through a restructured payment plan, which cost Derek a secondary investment property, a small commercial space he'd acquired 3 years ago that had been part of the Eastern Development portfolio. Selling it hurt him professionally. His reputation in the development community contracted. The meetings he used to get because his name carried weight became meetings he had to work harder to secure. He downsized his office. Let another staff member go, this one voluntarily, a young associate who found a better position elsewhere, and Derek didn't try to retain because he couldn't match the offer. I watched all of this from a distance, not with pleasure. I want to be clear about that because I think it would be easy to read this as a story of revenge settling into satisfaction, and that's not what I felt. What I felt was the specific grief of watching someone you love face the consequences of who they chose to be, knowing that the facing of it is necessary and knowing it hurts anyway. Derek met the trust conditions in full. He signed the conduct acknowledgement in Margaret's office on a Tuesday morning with Christine as witness. Margaret called me afterward and said, "He read every word. He didn't change anything." I sat with the phone after she hung up and looked at the wall for a long time. The conditions also required something from me, though I hadn't framed it as a condition. It was a decision I made on my own. I went back to the house in early March to collect the rest of my things. Not to make a point, to close something. Gloria was still there, working her last 2 weeks. The family was moving to a rental across town while Derek looked for something to buy in a more affordable neighborhood. She met me at the door the way she had when I came to pack my bags, with that careful respect she'd always shown me. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Gloria," I said. "How are the children?" "Lily cried about the move," she said. "Marcus didn't. He's been very—" She paused. "Very quiet." Marcus quiet was worse than Marcus crying, and I knew it from having known him for 10 years. "Is he home?" I said. He was. He came downstairs when he heard my voice, and the sight of him, taller than I remembered, which is what happens when you don't see someone for 2 months at that age, hit me in the chest the way love hits you when you've been keeping it at arm's length out of necessity. He stood on the bottom stair and looked at me with Eleanor's eyes. "Hey, Grandpa," he said. "Hey, Bud," I said. He came the rest of the way down the stairs and hugged me, not the performative hug of children complying with adult social expectations, but a real one. His arms tight, his face pressed briefly against my shoulder. I held the back of his head and I thought about the blue notebook on his pillow and the concert program with my name on the back. "I'm sorry I missed the concert," I said. He pulled back and looked at me seriously. "Dad said you had some things to work out," he said. "That's true," I said. That was an honest thing for him to say. Marcus considered this with the gravity of a 10-year-old processing a world more complicated than he'd been promised. "Are you going to come to things again?" he said. "Yes," I said. "I'm going to come to things." He nodded once, satisfied, and went back upstairs. Not because he was finished with me, because he was 10 and had processed what he needed to process, and there was presumably something upstairs that required his attention. That was exactly right. That was exactly how it should be. I got the rest of my things. Eleanor's remaining pieces, the items I'd left behind in the first departure, were boxed in my old bedroom, and I moved them to the car in 3 trips. The rose bed outside was starting to show the first suggestions of spring, the canes putting out small red buds that would either make it or not make it, depending on whether the frost was finished. On the last trip, I stood in the front hall for a moment. The house without Sandra's decorating vision was returning to something more neutral. She'd had the console table moved out, and Eleanor's coat rack was back in its place. I didn't know if that was Derek or coincidence. I put my hand on the coat rack. Eleanor had bought it at an estate sale in 1991, a thing with iron hooks shaped like ginkgo leaves. She had loved it with the specific love she reserved for objects that had history in them. I left the coat rack where it was. Some things didn't need to come with me. Some things could stay in the house they'd always been in, belonging to it in a way that outlasted the people who'd lived around them. I drove back to Frank's one last time to collect my remaining bags. I had found a place. A 2-bedroom apartment in a building 12 minutes from Margaret's office, with high ceilings and a small balcony that faced west. Not a senior community, Not Sunrise Gardens or Maple Crest or any of the brochures Sandra had placed on my breakfast table. An apartment, in a building with people of all ages, where I would have my own door and my own key and my own coffee cup without a chip on the rim. It was not perfect. The building had a parking situation that required negotiation, and one of the neighbors had a dog that operated at a volume suggesting the dog had opinions it felt strongly about. The kitchen was smaller than I was used to. It was entirely mine. Frank helped me carry boxes on moving day. He made 2 unnecessary trips to make sure he was there for the whole thing, which was Frank's way of doing the things he didn't say. Carol sent a container of food and a plant for the balcony, a small rosemary that she said was nearly impossible to kill, which was both practical and, I suspected, a message. When Frank left that evening, he stood in the doorway of the apartment and looked at me with the expression he'd had at Eleanor's funeral. That particular frank expression of a man feeling something large that he will not perform for you but wants you to know is there. "You look better," he said. "I feel better," I said, which was true, mostly. With edges, with complicated parts I was still working through, but true. "Good," he said. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder. "Call me." "Every week," I said. He left. I stood in my apartment, those words still new enough to require repetition, and looked at the boxes and the rosemary on the balcony and the photograph of Eleanor and me that I had propped against the wall because I hadn't yet decided where to hang it. I was 72 years old. I had slept on a park bench and in a diner booth and in my brother's guest room. I had sat in a conference room and said true things out loud to my son and watched his face while the truth landed. I had lost 3 years of my life to a slow erosion I had allowed and a manipulation I had not. And I had found my way back to myself through my dead father's careful architecture and a lawyer who answered her phone at midnight. I had not arrived somewhere easy. I had arrived somewhere real. In a drawer in one of the boxes was the blue notebook Marcus had never received, the one I'd left on his pillow the day I packed my bags. It had made its way back to me. Gloria had found it and packed it with my things, probably understanding, in the quiet way she understood things, that it belonged with me now. I took it out and set it on the kitchen counter. I hadn't decided yet what to do next. Not with the trust, not with Derek, not with the future that was going to be whatever it was going to be. There were more conversations ahead, more conditions to monitor, more of Derek's consequences to unfold. There was the question of Marcus and Lily and how to be present in their lives going forward across the new distances. There was the question of what I was going to do with my days in this apartment, with its west-facing balcony and its rosemary plant and its complicated parking. But that night, I put the kettle on and I stood at the kitchen window and I thought about my father, about what he had known, about the 32 years his careful work had sat waiting, patient as a mountain, for the moment it was needed. He had known. In the way that certain people know things they cannot fully explain, he had known that the people we love are also people, and people are unpredictable. And the most loving thing you can do is build something that will protect them from each other and from themselves when the predictable becomes the real. I thought about what that kind of knowing looked like, turned forward instead of backward. What it looked like to build something not from grief, but from everything I understood now that I hadn't understood before. The kettle clicked off. I poured my tea. And for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, I felt something in me lean toward the future instead of away from it. The rosemary plant Carol sent did not die. I want to say that first because when you are 72 years old and someone hands you a living thing and says it's nearly impossible to kill, you take that as something more than gardening advice. You take it as a small piece of evidence that certain things can hold on through difficult conditions. That survival is sometimes less about talent and more about the decision to stay rooted. It sat on my balcony through the rest of that winter and into spring, and by April it had doubled in size and smelled on warm evenings, like something Eleanor used to put in the roasting pan on Sunday afternoons. I ate dinner on that balcony when the weather permitted, and I talked to it sometimes, which I am aware is the behavior of a man living alone who has begun assigning personality to his plants. I did not care. There was no one to perform sanity for, and that freedom, the freedom of a space that was entirely mine, where I could talk to the rosemary and leave books open on the floor and eat breakfast at any hour without consulting anyone's schedule, was something I had not realized I'd been missing until it came back. Spring brought other things too. Margaret called me on a Thursday in April with a tone in her voice that I had learned over years meant something significant, not alarming, significant. "The documentation is ready," she said. "The Whitmore Senior Housing Initiative. We can file next week if you want to proceed." I sat on the balcony with the phone. The rosemary was in front of me. The afternoon light was coming from the west and going gold. "File it," I said. The idea had come to me in pieces over the preceding months. The way ideas come when you've lived long enough and been hurt enough that your thinking has texture it didn't have before. It hadn't arrived as a grand plan, more like a slow accumulation of recognition. I had spent a night on a park bench. I was 72 years old, in reasonable health, with a trust fund and an attorney and a brother 40 minutes away. I had resources and relationships and the particular stubbornness of a man built like my father. And even with all of that, I had been very close to simply collapsing. What happened to people who had none of those things? I knew the answer because Margaret knew the answer, and Frank knew the answer, and anyone who pays attention to the world knows the answer. Elderly people, especially women, especially those without accumulated assets, were pushed out of their homes by their families and ended up in situations that nobody with options would choose. They ended up in Sunrise Gardens with the watercolor classes and the shuffleboard and the industrial cleaning smell. Not because it was what they wanted, but because when your family stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a logistical problem, your choices contract to the size of whatever others decide to offer you. My father had built a structure to protect me from that. I wanted to build something that could protect people who had no one building structures for them. The Whitmore Senior Housing Initiative was, in its initial form, not enormous. I was clear-eyed about what I could sustain without destabilizing the trust's long-term health. Margaret and I had spent considerable time on those numbers, and Christine had modeled several scenarios until we found one that was real rather than aspirational. We were not solving a national crisis. We were funding 12 units of supported independent housing for seniors who had been displaced from their primary residences due to family situations, alongside a legal resource fund that would connect elderly people facing exactly what I had faced with attorneys who could help them understand their rights before those rights were fully eroded. 12 units. One legal fund. A board of 3, with Margaret as chair and Frank as a member, which Frank had agreed to with the lack of ceremony that was his way of agreeing to things that mattered to him greatly. It was not nothing. It was also not everything. It was what I could do with what I had, which is all anyone can honestly say about the things they build. I named it after my father because it was his structure that had made it possible, and because Chester Whitmore had understood something about protection that I was only now beginning to practice. Well, Derek found out about the initiative from Frank, which was not how I had intended him to find out, but Frank and Derek had been in occasional contact in the months since the conference room. Not at my prompting, and not behind my back either, just Frank being Frank, maintaining the connections he believed in because he was constitutionally unable to allow family to fully dissolve if there was something he could do about it. Derek called me on a Sunday evening in May. I had learned by then to read Derek's calls by their timing. Weekday mornings were business-related, practical. Evening calls, especially Sundays, were personal. The conversations he had to work himself up to. "Frank told me what you're doing," he said, "with the trust." "Part of it," I said. "The initiative is a separate structure from the trust itself. Margaret helped me establish it as a standalone. Dad?" He stopped me. His voice was unsteady in the way it had been in my voicemails from February. "I'm not calling about the legal structure." I waited. "He told me about the housing," Derek said. "The 12 units and the legal fund." A pause. "He told me you're calling it the Chester Whitmore Initiative." "Yes," I said. A long silence. "You could have kept that money," Derek said. "All of it. You could have, after everything, you would have been entitled to just keep it and not—" He stopped. I could hear him gathering himself. "Why are you building something for other people?" It was the most honest question he had asked me in years, maybe ever. The kind of question that only gets asked when the performance is gone and the person underneath is genuinely trying to understand. "Because it happened to me," I said, "and I had resources. I had Margaret and Frank and my father's trust and 30 years of business experience, and it still almost finished me. I sat on a park bench in January, Derek, in 14-degree weather, and I was that close to not getting back up. Silence. I keep thinking about that, I said. I keep thinking about all the people who sit down on that bench and don't have what I had, who don't have the phone call to make. I paused. Your grandfather built something to protect me. The least I can do is pass some of that forward. Derek was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough. I put you on that bench. Yes, I said. You did. I'm sorry, Dad. Not the conference room apology or the porch apology or any of the other apologies he had offered in the months since. This one had a different quality, quieter and less articulate, the kind of sorry that knows it can't carry the full weight of what it's trying to say and says it anyway. I know you are, I said. Is it... He stopped, started again. Is it ever going to be okay between us? I had thought about this question, not in the abstract, not as a principle, but specifically, what did okay look like between Harold and Derek Whitmore, given the specific things that had happened between them, given the park bench and the conference room and the voicemails and Marcus's concert and the blue notebook and Eleanor's crystal and all of it? Not the way it was, I said. I don't think we get that back, and I'm not sure we should. The way it was had problems in it that neither of us was looking at clearly. I paused. But something real, something we both understand and don't pretend about. I think that's possible, if you want it. I want it, he said immediately. It takes time, I said, and it takes you doing things, not just feeling things. The feeling isn't enough, Derek. You know that. I know, he said. The financial reporting is current, I said. Yes, Christine confirmed it last week. And you're working with the independent accountant Margaret required? Every quarter, he said. It's actually... He paused. It's actually helped, having someone else look at the numbers. I was operating on assumptions for too long, having someone who asked questions I should have been asking myself. He stopped. That sounds like I'm looking for credit. It sounds like you're learning something, I said. That's different. A brief quiet. Marcus wants to come see your apartment, Derek said. He keeps asking. Lily does too, but Marcus specifically wants to know if you have a balcony because Frank told him about the plant. I looked at the rosemary. Tell them yes, I said. Next Saturday, if the weather holds. Yeah? His voice was lighter for the first time in the conversation. Yes, I said. Tell Marcus to bring whatever he's working on. I want to hear about the stories. He's been writing a lot, Derek said. He has 4 notebooks now. He carries one everywhere. I thought about the blue notebook I had left on his pillow. The note. For your stories. I love them. Grandpa, some things take root in unexpected places. That's all you can do. Leave the seeds and hope. The first tenant moved into the initiative housing in late June. Her name was Rosalie Ferris. She was 78 years old, and she had been living in her daughter-in-law's basement for 11 months after her son's family had taken over her house, under circumstances that the attorney from our legal fund was still carefully examining. Margaret showed me her intake form, not the private details, but the broad shape of it. Widowed, no savings accessible, a house she had lived in for 26 years that she was no longer able to return to. I asked Margaret if I could meet her. Margaret thought about it and said she'd check with Rosalie. Rosalie said yes. I brought the rosemary cutting I had taken from the balcony plant in May. Carol had told me how to do it, show me over the phone which angle to cut and how to put it in water until it rooted. It had rooted successfully, which I had taken as personally meaningful in the way that people take small things personally when they are processing large things. Rosalie's unit was on the 2nd floor, with a window that faced south. She was a small woman with white hair and the particular posture of someone who had learned to take up less space than they were entitled to. I recognized it because I had learned the same posture in my son's house and was still unlearning it. She looked at the rosemary cutting and then looked at me. What do I do with it? She said. Put it in a pot, I said. Water it when the soil is dry. It's hard to kill. She held it with both hands. I used to have a garden, she said. I know, I said. You'll have the window box outside your unit. The building manager knows how to set it up. She looked at me for a moment with the direct look of a woman who has stopped being surprised by the world, but retains the capacity to be moved by it. Why are you doing this? She said. I thought about all the true answers. I thought about the park bench and my father's voice in a 32-year-old document and Eleanor's rose beds and Marcus's eyes and the diner booth and Frank's frozen creek. Because someone should have built it sooner, I said. She nodded once, as if that was an adequate answer, and went back to unpacking. The initiative's first year was not smooth. I want to say that plainly because I have no interest in telling a version of this story where everything I built turned out perfect and vindicated and clean. It didn't. One of the 12 units had a plumbing situation in September that cost considerably more than the maintenance reserve anticipated, which required Frank and me and Margaret to have a three-way phone call on a Saturday morning that was not brief and not entirely calm. One of the residents had a conflict with a neighbor that required mediation. The legal fund ran out of its first-year allocation 6 weeks before the year was up, which meant we had to make a decision about deferring 2 cases to the following year, which I found genuinely painful and which Margaret found genuinely frustrating and which we both found genuinely necessary. We refunded it out of the trust's annual allocation and expanded the legal fund budget for year 2. Christine modeled the long-term impact. It worked, barely, with the right assumptions. We went with it. Real things are like that. They have budget shortfalls and plumbing problems and Saturday morning phone calls. The ones worth building are the ones you keep building anyway. Derek showed up to the initiative's first-year gathering in November. Not at my invitation. Frank had mentioned the date and time in passing, and Derek had called me the day before to ask whether it would be appropriate for him to come. I had thought about that question for 24 hours before I answered. Come, I said. It's not about us. Come and see what it is. He came alone. Sandra had, as best I could understand from the sparse information Derek offered about his marriage, been doing a sustained reckoning of her own since the conference room and the house sale and the collapsed deal and the downsized office. Not a dramatic reckoning. Sandra was not dramatic. But I noticed, in the few interactions I had with her in the months since, that the careful efficiency was quieter. The management was less total. Whether that was genuine change or circumstantial adaptation I could not fully determine, and I had decided I did not need to determine it. That was between her and Derek, and between her and herself. Derek stood in the gathering room of the initiative building and looked at the 12 residents and the board members and the attorneys from the legal fund and the woman from the city housing office who had become our primary bureaucratic contact, and I watched him take it in. He was quiet for most of the evening. He talked to Frank for a while and to Margaret briefly. He talked to Rosalie Ferris, which I had not arranged and which I observed from across the room. I don't know what they said. I didn't ask afterward. Some things are between the people in them. On his way out, Derek stopped beside me at the door. He had his coat on. "This is something, Dad," he said. He was looking at the room, not at me. "It's a start," I said. He nodded. "I should have—" He stopped himself. Old habit, the apology loop. He'd been working on it. "Thank you for letting me come." "Thank you for coming," I said. He left. I watched him walk to his car, a smaller car than the one he'd driven 3 years ago, a practical thing. The car of a man who had stopped needing the performance of success and was figuring out what actual success felt like. And I stood in the doorway of the building my father's money had helped me build, and I felt the cold evening air, and I let it be what it was. Not healed, not finished, not the tidy ending where all the damage is repaired and everyone arrives at a better version of themselves simultaneously and the music swells. That's not life. That's not even a good story. Not really. Because good stories know that the mess doesn't fully resolve. It just becomes a mess you understand better. What I felt, standing in that doorway, was something more durable than resolution. I felt like myself. For the first time in longer than I could calculate, I felt like the man my father had raised, the man Eleanor had chosen, the man whose name was on a trust that had been sitting quietly for 32 years waiting to matter. Now, I want to speak to you directly, not as Harold Whitmore, as the person who has been carrying this story. I have told you about a park bench and a diner booth and a conference room and 12 units of housing and a rosemary plant on a balcony. I have told you about a son who made choices that reduced his father to a logistical problem, and a father who allowed himself to be reduced further than he should have, and what happened when those two failures finally met their reckoning. But the story I actually want you to take from this is not about trust funds or legal structures or the dramatic satisfaction of a powerful document brought to bear on the people who wronged you. Most of you don't have a family trust. Most of you won't have a Margaret. Most of you are working with what you have, which is the only thing any of us ever do. What I want you to hear is this. The moment you begin making yourself smaller so that someone else is more comfortable, that is the moment to stop. Not to fight, not to explode, just to stop. To ask yourself what you are accommodating and why, and whether the accommodation is generosity or whether it is the slow surrender of something you cannot afford to lose. Your dignity is not a negotiating position. It is not something you offer up in exchange for peace or love or belonging. It is the foundation, and when you let it be eroded brick by brick, day by day, tolerance by tolerance, you do not end up with peace. You end up on a park bench. And I want to say something about the children in this story, about Marcus with his notebooks and Lily, who cried about the move. Children do not deserve to be weaponized in family conflict, and they also do not deserve to be shielded from every truth. Marcus knew something was wrong. Children always know. The question is whether the adults around them name it clearly enough that the children don't spend their whole lives trying to decode it. I missed Marcus's concert. I still think about that. Not with the sharp pain of the early months, but with the dull ache of a thing that cannot be undone and can only be compensated for going forward by showing up every time you can. He has 5 notebooks now. I have read pages from 3 of them, sitting on my balcony with bad coffee and his serious 10-year-old face watching me for my reaction. His stories are violent and strange and full of characters with complicated loyalties, and I think they are extraordinary. I told him so. I try to tell him the true things now because I spent too long in a house where the true things were carefully managed, and I know what that cost everyone who lived there. Derek and I have Sunday phone calls now. Not every Sunday. We miss some. We reschedule. Life intervenes the way it does. But most Sundays. We talk about his business, which is smaller and more stable than before. We talk about Marcus and Lily. We talk occasionally and carefully about Eleanor, which we had stopped doing for years and which both of us needed more than we knew. We do not talk as though nothing happened. We cannot. The conference room is in the history between us, and the park bench is in the history between us, and the 12-day deadline and the brochures and the dinner I didn't attend and all of it. It is there, and it will always be there. But it is behind us now instead of between us, and that is a different position, and it makes the conversations possible in a way they weren't before. I am 73 years old now. My knees still ache when I sit too long. My coffee is better than the diner's. The rosemary is almost too large for its pot, and I have not yet decided whether to get a bigger one or to give part of it away and accept that things grow and change size and require new containers. I live in an apartment with a west-facing balcony and a neighbor's opinionated dog and high ceilings and a photograph of Eleanor and me at Niagara Falls hanging on the wall where I can see it from the kitchen table. I have coffee with Frank every other week, in person now that I've learned the route between us. I have quarterly meetings with Margaret and Christine about the initiative and the trust. I have Saturday visits from my grandchildren when the custody schedule and the school calendar and the general chaos of their lives permits. I have the blue notebook, which I have finally started writing in. Not a memoir, not this story exactly, more like the observations my father used to make in the margins of his documents. Small notes, accurate things, the kind of record that is useful to leave behind even if you are not certain anyone will read it. Some of what I have written is about how to recognize when you are being managed. Some of it is about what financial documents actually say versus what people tell you they say. Some of it is about the difference between love and the performance of love, and how to know which one you're receiving. Some of it is about parks in winter and bad coffee and the particular silence of a room after you have finally said the true thing. My father built protections because he knew that love, on its own, is not a structure. It is a feeling, and feelings are real, but they cannot hold assets or guarantee distributions or prevent a son from making choices his father didn't anticipate. You need the structure and the love. One without the other leaves you exposed. I built something with what he left me, something that will hold after I'm gone, that will keep making decisions and housing people and funding attorneys because the structure is designed to continue. It has a board and bylaws and an amendment process and an annual budget that Christine reviews with the particular intensity of someone who takes this very seriously. Chester Whitmore built for me. I built in his name. And maybe Marcus, with his 5 notebooks and his complicated characters and his grandmother's eyes, will build something in all of our names someday. That is how it goes, if you do it right. You protect what you love, and you teach what you know, and you refuse. Even when you are tired, even when you are cold, even when you are sitting on a frozen park bench at 11 at night with nowhere to go, you refuse to believe that you are finished, because here is what I know now that I did not know on that bench. The people who tell you that you are finished are not reporting a fact. They are making a bid. They are testing whether you will accept their definition of you, whether you will take their estimate of your remaining value and agree to live inside it. Don't agree. You are not finished until you decide you're finished. And even then, I would encourage you to wait one more day, make one more phone call, sit in one more diner booth until the morning comes. The morning always comes. I know, because I was there when it did. And I'm still here, standing in the doorway of something I built in the last good years of a life that almost ended on a bench, telling you that the most important thing I ever did was refuse to stay down. Whatever bench you're sitting on tonight, whatever cold and dark has closed around you, I want you to know that the call you're afraid to make is worth making. The document you haven't read is worth reading. The room you're afraid to walk into is worth entering. Walk in. Say the true thing. And don't you dare apologize for taking up the space you were always entitled to. That is the whole of it. That is everything I know.